And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. But I've been asked to give a presentation, so I will, because sometimes I like to do as I'm told, not very often. The title that has been advertised, and some of you saw it outside and walked in, so I might as well honor the title, is a question. Is capitalism devouring democracy? Allow me to begin with a slightly different question. Have you noticed how in the last few decades the quality of politicians has tumbled? Not just in this country, everywhere. For God's sakes, even I became a politician in 2015. No, but seriously, there is a marked diminution in the rhetoric, in the capacity of politicians to inspire, and indeed in the power that they have. Now, I don't believe that this is due to a degeneration of the DNA of humanity or of those who are interested in politics. What we have been observing is the shrinking of what I shall refer to as the political sphere. There used to be a time before capitalism when there was one sphere, the sphere of power. It was impossible to separate economic power from political power. The king had He had military power produced political power, and political power and economic power were one and the same thing. There is no great mystery really as to why there was no economics 150 years ago. Think about Harvard University did not have an economics department in the 19th century. Why? Because there was no need for it before capitalism came of age. Before capitalism, the political and the economic sphere were one. It was only with the Enclosures in Britain that you had a remarkable transformation of society, that great transformation. The shifting from feudalism to capitalism. Effectively, the peasants were evicted from the land, replaced by sheep, because of the international trade routes that were creating an international market for wool, and some commodities like wool, like steel, like spices and so on, were emerging as international commodities with prices that were determined at the level of the international trade routes system. And all the other commodities, goods, were effectively sidelined. So the lord of the land in Yorkshire or in Manchester had absolutely no incentive to retain those peasants, planting idiotic little, vegetables, when they could just chuck them out of the land, replace them with fat sheep, whose wool suddenly had an international exchange value. But the Enclosures created the working class. It created the commodification of labor. Up until then, people worked very hard, but they didn't sell their labor. We had a very interesting reversal of the timing of economic production and distribution. Under feudalism, we had work, production first. People actually toiled, they worked the land, and they produced the harvest. Production came first. Then came distribution. The lord of the land, or the manor or whatever, would send the sheriff in and take his cut from the harvest. How much he would take and how much he would leave behind was a political issue. It had to do with military power. It had to do even with the benevolence of the Lord. It had to do with the extent to which the Lord needed to keep the peasants on side in case another lord tried to usurp his property rights over the land. It was a political, diplomatic, ethical, religious, economic process that determined distribution after production. And then finally, the surplus that the lord amassed was sold in nearby markets, and that created a financial surplus for the lord, which then he lent out. So we had production, distribution, and then finally, finance. But with the Enclosures and the eviction of the peasantry, we had the exact opposite. Because suddenly, the last thing that lords wanted to do is to work or to be entrepreneurial. So the replacement of the peasants with the sheep meant that suddenly every acre of land had an economic value, an exchange value, a price that did not exist. That was not the case before. Why did it acquire this price? Because you knew how many sheep you could raise on an acre. You know how much, more or less, wool you would produce. International markets were providing the equilibrium price of the wool, so you knew how much exchange value, money, you could gather per acre of your land. And of course, then, once that price was established, that exchange value per acre was established, suddenly land became a commodity, to be rented out, to be sold, to be purchased. There was no real estate market before that. Land was either you inherited land, in which case you had it, and if you never inherited land, you never got it. And the only way of effectively getting land that you didn't have was through war, through conquest, or if the king decided to grant you a plot of land. There was no such thing as a market for land, and there was no such thing as a market of labor. The enclosures, the eviction of the peasants, created land as a commodity, and of course labor as a commodity, because the evicted peasants, effectively, they were roaming around the country, knocking on doors saying, I will do anything for work, for a piece of bread. That's the first labor market. That had never happened before in the history of humanity. People with nothing selling their labor time. That's the beginning of capitalism. But with this, you have the separation of the economic from the political sphere for the first time in our history as a species. Because suddenly you had merchants who acquired huge power through the accumulation of financial surpluses. Because the internationalization of those trade routes, the emergence of these few commodities as international commodities that bestowed substantial financial surplus upon those who handled them, whether they were the merchants, the ship owners, or the lords of the land, whose land now was used in order to cultivate, in inverted commas, wool. For the first time, you had this separation. You had lords whose political power and social power was now becoming increasingly disproportional to their economic power. You had those, dirty merchants, as they considered them, the riffraff, the ugly, dirty merchants, acquiring huge quantities of economic power that had nothing to do with their social status. They were not allowed in the palace. They were not allowed in parliament. They were not allowed in the gentlemen's clubs in London. And suddenly they had a lot more economic power than the lords. So the economic and the political sphere separated. And with industrialization, you throw into this mix James Watt's great invention, the steam engine, and this process just goes berserk. And you have globalization, which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Manifesto described in the most poetic language when they say that capital must nestle everywhere, it must settle everywhere, it must enter into relations everywhere. And it was interesting because when Marx and Engels were writing that, it hadn't happened yet. But they foresaw the process that we live in, globalization. And with globalization now, we have, with this process of globalization, you have the establishment of these completely separate two spheres. Now, interestingly, in the 19th century, you will recall this. You live in a very historic town. Liberalism was a philosophy, a political philosophy, at odds with democracy. To be a genuine liberal, you must have been very skeptical about democracy, if not completely and utterly anti-democratic. The whole point about liberalism was how to preserve the right to track, barter, and exchange, in Adam Smith's famous expression, which was a right that many of the liberals, including John Stuart Mill, a very liberal person, a very progressive person for his age, he considered the idea of democracy. What is democracy? It's the rule of the many, to be a great impediment, if not a great threat, to liberalism. So this when we talk about liberal democracy today, we're talking about something that in the 19th century was a contradiction in terms. To be a liberal meant that you did not believe in democracy. Yeah? Now, what was it that brought about a change, a transformation? Suddenly, liberals started embracing the idea of democracy. It was economic crisis, financial and economic crisis, beginning especially in this country, but also in Europe in the 1840s. Because the moment capitalism started turbocharging itself with the creation of what I will describe as networked companies, with the advances in electromagnetism, with, electric engines, the telegraph, all the communication technology, electricity grids. When electricity comes into production and we move beyond steam, that's the second industrial revolution. When Edison created his empire, he created a networked company. Remember, from the electric bulb to the power generating station, to the grid, everything was part of this. We talk about Google now and Apple as being mega companies. Well, the mega company was invented with the second industrial revolution. But think about it, to set up a company like Edison's, or later Henry Ford's, and so on, you needed a lot of financing. You needed a lot of money. So suddenly, the new reversed order becomes very significant, because now, ever since the peasants were thrown out of the land, ever since the Enclosures in Britain, the Lord rented out, leased out an acre or a few acres to an ex-peasant and said, okay, I will charge you rent, you raise the sheep here, and you keep the difference, the residual payments. So once you pay for the land, me, once you pay the workers, the ones that have been expelled and now are working for a piece of bread, subsistence wages, once you pay for the sheep, for the shearing, scissors, whatever it is that you're using, your capital equipment, what you keep in the end is yours, is your profit. So suddenly these proto-entrepreneurs were forced, they didn't choose to do it, they were forced to become entrepreneurs. But how do you become an entrepreneur? First, you borrow. And usually you borrow it from the landlord. The landlord lends you the money to pay him rent, with interest. So you see the reversal? Instead of finance coming at the end, we used to have production, then exchange or distribution, and then finally finance. Now we have finance first. First, at the beginning there was the loan. Once the loan comes in, you hire the workers, you pay the rent, immediately you have distribution. So you have finance first, distribution second. The last thing that happens is production. So finance suddenly acquires a very special place in capitalism. Now, the beauty and ugliness of finance, of banking, is that it is a magical process. Because once we move from the landlord to Edison and Henry Ford, it is impossible to finance capitalism simply by the accumulated wealth of some rich person like the Lord. There was never enough money in the hands of any financier to provide Edison with the capital, with the money he needed in order to set up his networked firm. So you needed banks to conjure up money from nothing. And this is how finance has been working ever since the second industrial revolution. How? By creating money from thin air. There is a common fallacy in the popular culture that we live in, that banks operate like vaults, whereby you and I put our savings in, and somebody else goes to the bank and borrows money that comes from our savings, and that the banker makes a profit as a result of the difference between the interest rate that he pays us for depositing our money into his vault and the interest rate that he charges the person that has borrowed money in order to invest in a shop, in a factory, whatever. That is not what is going on. If you go to the bank tomorrow morning and you get a loan from the bank, the money is going to come out of thin air. The bank will create it out of nothing. It's really very simple. You get $100,000 to buy a house, to buy whatever, to invest in a business. What will happen is somebody's going to type 100,000, 100,000 into your bank account. So it's conjured up. The ancient Greeks had a word for money, nomisma, or coin, which comes from the verb nomizo, which means to imagine. So Aristotle defined the value of money as a common fiction since the ancient times. This is exactly what it is. So the banker simply types the money in there. You put your card in the ATM, suddenly you have 100,000. Somebody typed 100,000 on the system. And then what you can do is you can use web banking, you can wire the money. If you buy a car or a house, it goes to the bank account of the vendor. If you invest in a shop, it goes to the landlord, to another bank account, with the same banking system. It doesn't matter whether it's the same bank or not. So these digits that were typed into your account simply are transferred to another account. That's all that happens. Now, the hope of the banker is that you are going to use this money productively, you're going to earn money from that, and then you will give the banker the money that will effectively tie up that loose end with interest. Now, to the extent that this works, and it really works magnificently, in my book I relate this in the form of a metaphor, a science fiction metaphor. It's a bit like a banker being the specially gifted magician who has a very long arm and can push his arm, it's usually a he, so allow me not to say she or he, right? Through the timeline, he pushes his hand into the future, grabs value that has not been created yet, brings it, snatches it from the future, brings it into the present, and gives it to you. Hopefully, you do productive things, and you create a value that will repay the future. This is my preferred metaphor for what bankers do. But once they learn the beauty and the glory of doing this, and they are privileged, in a privileged spot, because they can take value from the future, bring it to the present, they don't do any work themselves. And because they are the mediators between future and present value, they're ultra-rich, and not only ultra-rich, but central in societal processes, political processes. So if you do this and it works, why not do more of it? Keep snatching more value from the future and bringing it to the present, and more and more. At some point, the present can no longer produce the value that it needs to produce in order to repay the present. And at that point, suddenly, those of us who have borrowed money, or some of us, have no capacity to repay it. A recession begins. People that work for us lose their jobs. They cannot repay their own loans. And then suddenly, the book of the bank is full of loans that are non-performing. At that point, if you and I, or those of us who have some money in the bank, realize that this is happening, we panic, we rush to the bank, this is a bank run, we ask for the cash is not there. And then you have the financial crisis that we had in this country and in Europe from the 1840s onwards. Now, to a very large extent, the United States of America, the way you understand your own country now, is the product of their political response to a sequence of financial crises beginning from the 1840s. Even the creation of the Federal Reserve in the beginning of the 20th century was a result of JP Morgan saying, I've had enough of bailing out my mates. Let's create a Federal Reserve that is going to be doing the job. And of course, he created it. And it was all stitched up amongst the bankers. Think of all the great institutions of this country, like Social Security, food stamps. They're the result of 1929. It's what brought this nation together, what created the United States of America the way you understand it. It's a sequence of financial collapses that puts together nations and polities and democratic processes. So let me go back to the beginning. We used to have one sphere of power. It was political, economic, cultural, military, power had many different facets, but it was one sphere in which it emerged from. Then it separated into two spheres, the political sphere and the economic sphere. And as it did, the political sphere was increasingly democratized. Why? Because all the important decisions were moving to the economic sphere. So legitimacy, political legitimacy, and the capacity of the regime, of the system that we live in, to maintain itself and to be sustainable through the common belief amongst the people that this is a legitimate system, was based on democratization, of giving people the idea that they had control over their communities, the nation, their politics. But this democratization was only accepted by the proponents of liberalism to the extent that all the important decisions were migrating from the political sphere as the political sphere was democratized. Women understand that. It's like, the feminization of certain professions. When women moved into teaching lost its power. When they moved into health, in Greece now, a majority of judges are women. And you should see the judicial system collapsing. So it's a very, very similar process that we see. Power is migrating from the economic sphere to the political sphere, and the political sphere is democratized, increasing it. Now, something fundamental happened beginning in this country in the 1970s. After the end of Bretton Woods, which was what? What was Bretton Woods? Let's not get complicated. It was the globalization of the New Deal. Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933, which was, what was the basic idea? To put the financial genie, the banking genie, back into its bottle, to make banking boring, effectively to ban bankers from doing things that allowed too much money to be created and too many bubbles to be built up, mobilizing idle savings, the idle savings of the richer members of society, and putting those idle savings, turning them into a force in the public interest, infrastructural works, public works, education, social security, and so on. That was the New Deal. In 1944, towards the end of the war, the New Dealers extended that New Deal internationally, as Europe was just a pile of ashes. Japan, you don't need me to explain what happened to Japan in 1945. So Bretton Woods, it was a magnificent system. Think about it. The United States officialdom in DC effectively designed a global capitalist system that was like a planned economy. You have fixed exchange rates, 4% interest rates forever, 20 years of 4% interest rates, no ups and downs. It was maybe plus or minus 0.1%. So you knew what your mortgage rate would be in the next 20 years. You knew if you wanted to change dollars for British pounds, you knew how many pounds you would get. You could get the same quantity year in, year out. So it was a world which was a nightmare for financiers. And of course, that was by design. Did you know that in the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944, Roosevelt imposed one single rule on his own. The rest he left to his minions. There were representatives from 100 different countries. Most of them already, they were not even liberated yet. They were under occupation because it was 1944. The Second World War had not ended. Experts, diplomats, politicians, and so on. One species of humanity was banned from entering the Washington Hotel. Bankers. A whole monetary global system was created on condition that bankers would not be part of it. Yeah? Interesting. If anybody proposed this today, they would immediately be branded as raving communist lunatics. This was Bretton Woods, 1944. It's important to think back about possibilities when we think of what is possible. Well, what happened in 1944 in Bretton Woods in 1930, 1931 in this country would have been completely pie in the sky. So anyway, but that system collapsed towards the end of the 1960s, officially 15th of August 1971, with Nixon's announcement that it's kaput, it's finished. I'm not going to go into this. But what happened after that was a very interesting, fascinating reversal in the flow of trade and money around the world. Before the collapse of Bretton Woods, what was happening was this. This is how Bretton Woods was designed. America was a surplus country. The country with surpluses, with profits, especially after the Second World War, was the only creditor country. The only country that had surpluses, financial surpluses, surpluses of goods, a net exporter. And what the United States administration did as part of Bretton Woods was to say, okay, the only way of preventing a return of the Great Depression to this land by 1949, they were very worried about 1949 because it was 1929 plus 20. The only way of preventing it is to make sure that, okay, number one, we convert all the factories from military production to civilian production, producing white goods instead of tanks and bullets, producing cars instead of aircraft carriers. Right, but that's not enough, because those factories during the war economy were so productive in this country that they were capable of producing so many washing machines, tractors, and cars that Americans would simply not have enough use for them. So the only way of preventing the Great Depression from returning was by selling them to the Europeans. But the Europeans didn't have money. So New Dealers, being very practical people, said, we'll give them the money. It's what's called the Marshall Aid Plan. Surplus recycling. For 20 years, United States was recycling about 70% of American profits in Japan and in Europe, because this is what you do if you're a clever hegemon. What you do is you make sure that the only way that you can continue to have surpluses vis-a-vis somebody else is to finance them. Because if you don't, then they won't be able to afford to buy your stuff. Then you won't be able to have surpluses. The problem was, however, that those surpluses disappeared by the late 60s. America shifted from a surplus position to a deficit position. Both the government went in deficit and the American economy developed a trade deficit. It is fascinating that what happened after the collapse of Bretton Woods had been imagined by some smart fellows in this country. Remember Henry Kissinger? Yeah. Exactly my feelings. But he's a smart cookie, right? And in 1970, a year before the end of Bretton Woods, he was not yet Secretary of State. He was still head of the National Security Council. And of course, he's a cold warrior, geopolitical thinker. He thinks in terms of, a bit like Metternich would have in the 19th century. He comes from the same part of the world, has the same accent. So he asked all the people that were working for him the pertinent question. Now that the United States is shifting into a deficit position, we used to be a surplus, now we're going to become a deficit country. How can we maintain our global hegemony? Because it has never happened in the past. All empires, superpowers, fell once they became deficit countries or economic blocs. So he was worried about that. He didn't give a damn about economics, but he cared about power. A young man wrote a memo, 3/4 of a page, in reply. It was the most brilliant reply, and the one that really explains what happened between the 1970s and 2008 in the world, and of course in the United States. His answer was, it doesn't really matter whose surpluses are being recycled. What really matters to maintain in control is to be the one who is recycling other people's surpluses. Get it? We can maintain our superpower status, our hegemony, as long as we do the recycling of surpluses, even if the surpluses are not ours. Think about it. This is exactly the model that we have been living through between the 1970s and 2008. America turned into a deficit country. And now Donald Trump is complaining, we have a huge trade deficit with China, with Germany, we need to eliminate it. Either he's completely unschooled or he's lying, or both. I added a third option. Because, look, the globalization would not have happened without the American deficits. The American trade deficit operated like a gigantic vacuum cleaner that was sucking into this country the net exports of Germany, of Holland, of France, of Japan, and later, of course, of China, keeping those factories going at full blast. And this deficit kept increasing. It is this increasing American trade deficit that kept globalized capitalism in rude health. Now, of course, the question then is, how was it being paid for? Because Greece had a big deficit, and look at what happened to us. Well, this is the exorbitant privilege of the United States of America. At the very same time that the trade deficit was expanding, the rest of the world was sending to this country 70% of all profits the Germans made, the Dutch made, the Japanese made, and the Chinese are making. 70% of global profits were coming into Wall Street, seeking higher returns, being used to purchase US Treasury bills, American government debt. And so you had a pure recycling loop. So recycling was discovered by this young man, whose name, by the way, is Paul Volcker, who then became the chairman of the Fed. And who, just a week before he assumed the position of chairman of the Fed, in a lecture he gave at the University of Warwick in England, he said, this is the time when a controlled disintegration of the world economy is in the interest of the United States of America. Verbatim. I've learned this off by heart because it's so exciting. The controlled disintegration of the world economy. So that's what he meant. So you had this amazing system where you have increasing imbalances globally. America growing its deficits. Germany and Japan and then China growing its surpluses. When we increase our deficit, we are creating an imbalance. When somebody else is increasing their surplus, that's an imbalance. And globalization was based on this. Financialization. What's financialization? Why was Wall Street allowed to go crazy? Why were all the checks and balances that the new dealers introduced and Bretton Woods introduced, why did they go to the dogs? Why did Larry Summers, I believe he's got some connection with this place, why was he allowed to commit the crime against logic and humanity, to unleash the Wall Street bankers from their shackles, the result being 2008? The answer is because without unleashing the Wall Street bankers, it was impossible to close that loop. The only way you could have this model of the world economy, where the United States deficit was keeping the rest of globalization going, with the rest of the world sending its surpluses into Wall Street, for Wall Street to close the loop and pay for the deficit, was to let the Wall Street bankers do as they pleased. And when you do let the Wall Street bankers do as they please, you know what they do? You give a banker a few billion every day for 5 minutes. Just park 5 billion with a banker for 5 minutes every day. This is to invite them to create very sophisticated bets using that 5 billion every day that they are always going to win. If I were to give you 5 billion every day for 5 minutes, you will work out ways of making a load of money, and exponentially increasing load of money. Anyway, the problem is that they built so many pyramids of financialized derivatives on top of this tsunami of capital that the rest of the world was saying, that it combusted in 2008, and the result was what we're facing. So, the point I'm making is that first you had the joint sphere of power, then that bisected into the political and the economic sphere. Then after the 1970s, the end of Bretton Woods, the economic sphere also divided and multiplied between the industrial sphere and the financial sphere. And all power ended up with finance. Because if you allow bankers to push their hand into the future so majestically, frequently, and without any kind of control, to bring value that has not been produced yet into the future and effectively to appropriate it themselves. And then you also say to them that they're too big to fail, and when they fail, then austerity for all is combined with socialism for the bankers. Then they have no reason why not to keep undermining capitalism again and again and again. So, remember the question with which I started. Why do politicians seem to be so much less talented today than they were, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Well, the answer is because the political sphere is completely powerless. The spheres that now have acquired power are the economic sphere and, magnificently, the financial sphere. So if you're a young, talented person who wants to change the world, who wants to do things, who's not very ideological or historically minded, who wants power? What do you want to be, President of the United States or CEO of Goldman Sachs? CEO of Goldman Sachs. I remember the one longish conversation I had with Barack Obama when I was the finance minister of Greece. The first thing he said to me was, I feel solidarity for the Greek people and we're behind you, but there's not much I can do to help. Okay? And then he immediately, without me saying anything, he went into a soliloquy justifying himself by saying, when I got elected, I realized there was nothing I could do because Wall Street had just imploded and I had to save them, and that was, he said, political poison for me. Now, I don't know whether he believed it or not, and I can't see how he can explain the fact that he appointed Larry Summers to sort out the mess, unless, of course, you adopt the cynical view that it takes a murderer to work out how the criminal justice system should be reformed. So this is effectively the point I'm making. So, is capitalism consistent or sustainable within a democratic polity? Can it coexist with democracy? Absolutely not. Because capitalism is generating this shift of power away from the political sphere. And even if you have fantastically scripted constitutions, beautiful congresses with wonderful procedures and so on, power is going to shift away from those processes. They're going to become fig leaves for a system where power lives somewhere else. In my first meeting of finance ministers in Europe, I was exposed to this harsh reality, which I always knew, but it's one thing to know it as a radical lefty that theorizes and puts forward, various working hypotheses in an academic environment. It's quite another to be told straight in your face. That was the beauty of those few months I spent in government, was exactly that. I didn't have to theorize anymore. I went to my first meeting of the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is the meeting of the European Union finance ministers of the countries that share the same currency, the euro. So I walked in there and I tried to be as moderate and as sensible and as friendly as anyone who comes from a country that is bankrupt and whose new government has a title, or the party that won, coalition of the radical left. Yeah? So there I was, the Minister of Finance representing the coalition of the radical left in that cesspool of conservatism. And I tried to be, all I said was that we are facing a challenge, colleagues, I said. There is the principle, I said, of continuity in democracies, in liberal democracies. In other words, we're not going to start at year zero just because we're just elected. We have obligations to you that previous governments, Greek governments, have assumed, and which, of course, we were against, our party was against, but nevertheless, our state, because of the principle of continuity, still has these obligations to you, and therefore I cannot dismiss them. I have to take them seriously. I am obliged by the principle of continuity. At the same time, there is another principle, the principle of democracy. I could see that they didn't like that very much. And the principle of democracy is very simple. I have a mandate from the people of Greece to challenge all these obligations that we have, this particular fiscal and monetary policy that you've been imposing upon my country, which led to a Great Depression, which led me to be here, because if we didn't have a Great Depression, the Greeks were not stupid enough to vote for me. I mean, they didn't just become left-wingers. You know, our party went from 4% to 40% in 2.5 years because of the Great Depression. I didn't put it in those very words, but you can imagine. But more or less, this was my I was trying to be extremely open to them and moderate and conciliatory with Wolfgang Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany. Okay. And I said, well, what happens in a democracy when two principles clash? The principle of continuity and the principle of democracy. Well, we sit around the table like civilized people and we find a compromise. This is what democracies do. Liberal democracies, yes? I sit down. The French minister loved what I said, of course. Just complete hot air. Yes. I could see Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. He was looking at me with, eyes that felt like laser beams. And he gets the floor and he said, one sentence, which is the one that I'm going to leave you with. Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Got it? My response was, this is excellent news to the Chinese Communist Party because they believe that too. And I then came up with a proposal. This is why they hated me. I was very moderate. I said, in that case, Wolfgang, let's ban elections in bankrupt countries. Let's come out and declare that in the European Union, you can only have democracy if you're a creditor country. If you're a debtor country, no democracy. Elections cannot be allowed to change anything because we have a loan agreement. We have a debtor's prison. Let's put Greece in the workhouse. I didn't say all these things, but I did say the thing about the Chinese Communist Party. And also the proposal that we suspend elections while a country is in the red, in the European Union. That would be more honest. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is that Schäuble was right. In the globalized, financialized capitalism that we've created, elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Because economic policy simply springs out of the processes that I described that leave absolutely no room for anything beyond a semblance of a democratic process that legitimizes the lack of democracy. We live in pure ironclad oligarchies which require, for legitimation purposes and for their reproduction, that we think that we live in democracies. Now, the tragedy is that capitalism is being overthrown. Not by the left. We are useless. Progressives, left-wingers, are a catastrophe. Has anybody seen The Life of Brian, Monty Python's movie? Remember the opening scene when they all hate each other? The Jews of the Liberation Front of Judea, whose worst enemy is the Liberation People's Front of Judea. That's the left. We are sectarian. We hate each other more than we hate anything else. Yeah. No, but and of course, and when we did overthrow capitalism, we created the Gulag. So we are a disaster. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try again and to do it properly and democratically. But let's face it, capitalism is overthrowing itself with no help from us. And it's doing it in two ways. Firstly, think of 2008. This financialization process that I described imploded under the weight of its own hubris. And the result is a never-ending crisis. Don't believe anybody who tells you that the 2008 crisis ended. It never ended. It is continuing. It is mutating. It's taking different forms. It migrates. It goes to different parts of the world. It takes, for instance, in Germany, it takes the form of negative interest rates that are eating into the pension funds of the average middle-class person, who then turns against the political system and votes for the fascists of the Alternative für Deutschland. They don't have unemployment, but they have this sense of deflation of their hard-earned savings that creates the rise of xenophobia, racism, and the ultra-right. In my country, we have a Nazi party in parliament because we have a Great Depression, because we have an unemployment rate of 30%. And we have no interest rates because nobody's lending to anyone, because everybody's bankrupt. Yeah? In China, you have an investment rate, the proportion of GDP, of national income, that goes into investment is gigantic. It's 48%. 48 cents to every dollar earned in China goes into investment. Now, investment is a good thing, but overinvestment simply means that the Chinese authorities have given up on the West. Because, let's face it, the only reason why you don't have a Great Depression in this country today is because in 2008, which was your version, our version of 1929, two things happened differently to what happened in 1929. One was that the Federal Reserve started printing money as if there is no tomorrow. Didn't happen in 1929. And the second thing was China boosted its investment ratio so high in order to rebalance global capitalism. They did it very well, but it's not sustainable. So Europe is not sustainable, China is not even sustainable, and the United States today, which is celebrating growth, what growth? You have 2.5% growth. All the things that shouldn't grow, grow. The things that should grow are not growing. You do not have any serious investment in good quality jobs in this country. You have wage stagnation. You have a situation, people say, oh, it's, this idiocy of the Democratic Party that Putin won the election against Hillary Clinton. Come on, wake up. You cannot say to Trump voters that they're idiots and Putin duped them. I mean, you can say that, but then that's it. You lose them forever. And it's also not true. People say to me, well, how do you explain that Trump won? I'm an economist, so I look at numbers. The number that I think is most spectacular in this country is that in 2016, more than half of the families in this country could not afford the cheapest new car, which cost $14,000. Either they didn't have the money, or they didn't have the money and they did not have the credit ratings necessary to borrow $14,000. More than half of the families cannot afford the cheapest car. That's why Trump got elected. Because Obama failed spectacularly to shift the burdens of the crisis of the financial sector onto the 0.1%. So, I've spoken for far too long. Let's end on a positive note. Shall we? Technically, it's really very simple how to solve the problem or how to begin a process. We need a New Deal, except that this must be an international New Deal. Exactly as the New Deal was in 1933, but globally. That's not new. Bretton Woods was an international New Deal. So we need a new Bretton Woods. We need progressives in this country, progressives in Europe, to get their act together and start collaborating. Because, the bankers are very good at being internationalists. They love each other and they work very closely together. The fascists are fantastic. Trump loves Le Pen, Orban, the Alternative for Deutschland. They love each other, they cooperate. They have very good... Only we progressives fail to get together and start believing that it is possible to do that which has already been done before. It's not pie-in-the-sky stuff. Now, this in order to ameliorate the effects of the ongoing crisis after 2008. Then, once we stabilize the world, like Bretton Woods stabilized the world after the Second World War, then we can start thinking about post-capitalism. Because we must. Capitalism is overturning itself, not only through its crisis, but also through the technologies that it is creating. 3D printing, artificial intelligence, the internet, will make sure that in a few years there will be no need to have a corporation. Corporations will lack their raison d'etre. The only reason why you have General Motors is the economies of scale. Economies of scale are dying because of the new technologies that capitalism is creating. So you are going to have a situation in which we are going to have magnificent productivity, magnificent capacity to produce stuff, but the large majority will not be able to buy any of it. So that will be a crisis of not just the poor and the have-nots, but also the haves. But we must never believe that because there's going to be a crisis of capitalism, because capitalism is going to undermine and overthrow itself, good things will happen. In the 1930s, capitalism imploded and Nazism happened. So we can have one certainty: capitalism cannot maintain itself. Something else, another system of organizing economic and political life is going to follow. And we better make sure that the way in which we choose as a species, as a humanity, that different way of doing things is selected democratically. Because even though democracy takes too long, as Oscar Wilde said, socialism would never happen because it takes too many long evenings. And it's tedious. There's no doubt about that. If you've been to a political meeting, you know how tedious it is. It's the only choice we have. And thankfully, we are creating the technologies that will make these debates both more manageable and more hopeful in terms of delivering a future that resembles, as I say in the book, Star Trek and not the Matrix. Thank you.
So Yanis, you're a very interesting combination of idealism and pragmatism. You identified the problem that we have here, which led to somehow Trump being elected. Yet that terrible income inequality, which has gotten way worse in the last 12 months and looks like it's going to get worse, even more, get worse again, did not produce enough people to elect Bernie Sanders. And I went to his rallies and he said great things. Do you think that this country just can't wrap its head around that word socialist? And that's my question, is does it have to repackage the thinking?
Well, I used to think that until Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist and won the primary election before it was stolen from him. Bernie Sanders won the election, or he would have won the election if the National Democratic Committee did not do its utmost to perform a coup d'etat against him. And this, I'm stating this as an accusation. The Democratic Party is its own worst enemy.
So given that, this is the substrate that we have to work with, how do we change the thinking? If we want the things that that party is proposing, how do we get the electorate to change their voting? Why did they vote for Trump? Why?
Well, firstly, the abstention rate was quite high. A lot of good people could simply not bring themselves to vote for Hillary, and they didn't vote at all. And many others. I wasn't here during your election campaign, but I was in Britain before the Brexit referendum, and I believe that there are great similarities between the two. And I remember I was campaigning against Brexit in Britain, in the same way I would have campaigned against Trump here, of course. And I remember asking people who were not racist, who were not xenophobic, who were not right-wing, who were not anti-European, why are you voting for Brexit? And the answer had nothing to do with Europe. The answer was this: if I vote to remain in the European Union, those bastards that have been treating me like a discarded piece of rag, a discarded rag, are going to be very happy. So I'm going to cast my vote in a manner that maximizes the discomfort of those who've been treating me as if I'm not a human. Now, I don't know, you have to tell me whether this is an appropriate comparison to what was going on here. A lot of people who voted for Trump simply wanted to punish the establishment. And they wanted, I think that there's quite a lot of supporting evidence. Of course, there are racists, and there are Nazis, and there are right-wingers, and bigots, and misogynists who voted for Trump. But I don't think that those were the ones who made the difference. The ones who made the difference were the ones who could not afford a car, the ones who had believed in Obama and who voted for Obama in 2008. I'm reading at the data, and there seems to be a very large number of voters who voted for Obama in 2008 and Trump in 2016. Now, that cannot be explained on the basis of racism. Cannot be explained on the basis of misogyny. It is simply, to hell with you. I am not going to vindicate yet again a presidential candidate who goes into Wall Street 6 months before the presidential election, gives private speeches for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and, excuse the language, sits on people like me in front of the bankers, calling me names and promising to them that they will be allowed to continue doing that which has put us and our country in this position.
So, trying to be optimistic here for a moment. If we were trying to create some kind of apparatus, I mean, in the 50s, Roosevelt did the very thing that they said was impossible. He put 90% tax on corporate America to fund all these great schemes, the Social Security system, Medicare. These things were made possible, but the workers had unions then, quite strong unions. Now that's all been taken away. How are people going to organize and overthrow the system? As you say, I mean, it may implode, but in the interim, people are just surviving on $10 an hour wages or not surviving. So where is the impetus for revolution?
You do not need punitive tax rates now. You don't need 90%. This was a gimmick anyway.
It worked.
Yeah, I mean, it was more of a political stunt. I don't believe that it is necessary to have such high tax rates. But what you do need is you need to change the discourse in a way that appeals not only to those who would have joined trade unions, but to people who would never have imagined themselves to be radical or even progressive. So let me give you an example. Take NAFTA. There's a lot of discussion in this country now about NAFTA. The liberal establishment says, free trade is everything. The pie is going to shrink if you do away with it. But some people in the Rust Belt say, well, that's your pie, that's not my pie. My pie has disappeared a long time ago. So if I can manage to hold on to a few, steel workers' jobs by means of tariffs, let's do it, because it's better than all of us being thrown into the dustbin. Why not change the narrative and say, yes, we want to renegotiate NAFTA, along the following lines. If Mexico wants to continue to have, or Mexican capitalists want to continue to have free access to the American market, Mexico is going to have to introduce a minimum wage in Mexico that provides a living wage by Mexican standards, not by American standards, to the workers who work in the factories that produce the stuff that are then transported over to the United States. Now, that is a progressive renegotiation of NAFTA. Not tariffs, but minimum living wages in the poorer countries. So that way...
Not building a wall.
Of course not building a wall. But then you wouldn't need to build the wall.
Of course you wouldn't, no.
So that is one example. Take, for instance, the question about the health service here, the health system. Well, you don't have a health system, the absence of a health system. Obamacare was a complete disaster. Obamacare is an affront against logic. The idea of universal cover is absolutely essential, but also the idea that the state is going to be subsidizing private companies to provide public health without any controls regarding the prices of the services and the pharmaceuticals is a catastrophe. It's like effectively subsidizing the private insurers. This is why, of course, they contributed massively to Obama's campaign. Without the so-called public option. It's ludicrous. So how about the following argument about having a proper national health service, a public health service system in the United States, so that we can introduce tax cuts? Think about that. That would really throw the Republicans, wouldn't it? Because your health system is the most expensive in the world. You pay twice as much on health than the rest of the world, and you have far worse outcomes. So imagine that you created a proper public system. You'd save a huge amount of money, public money, and then you could give them away as tax cuts. But why not also say that those tax cuts will go to the lowest wage earners, not to the top? So that's how you change the debate. You get out of the way of the stereotype that the Republicans are trying to create for you. Huh?
Absolutely.
And you subvert the dominant way of thinking.
So I would like to hog the questioning, but I don't think it's fair, because I'm sure there are lots of good questions that are going to come from the audience. So I'm going to open up the questions. And
Okay.
if you could confine it to one, I would be appreciative.
It may be 1.5. I thought for a minute your talk was going to be almost entirely about Harvard. Marshall, who announced it at Harvard commencement, Kissinger, and then Larry Summers. I have this idea that maybe Obama was put in the White House to bail out Harvard, whose endowment went from losing $11 billion to regaining it. I think many people in this country are still not convinced that Obama did have a choice. Now, you said, I believe that he did, but can you be a little more specific about, and you sort of writ large, you talk about a New Deal. Could you be more specific about what a person in the White House could have done, what it would have looked like that would have been more like bailing out Wall Street, more like bailing out Main Street than bailing out Wall Street? And can you explain why the social democratic politics of building a politics where we control the government and regulate capitalism is not the way to go, but some other alternative politics is what you're implying, but you haven't really, I don't think, spelled out.
Okay, I'll start from the second part. Look, the New Deal that I am suggesting as a first step is social democratic, but in the good old-fashioned sense of it. So you need social democratic measures in order to stabilize the political economy before we can have a genuine conversation about what comes next, the more radical part. Creating, for instance, changing corporate law. I mean, corporate law is a political value judgment. So when some corporation goes bust, who gets paid first amongst the creditors is a political decision. So why not change it? Why have the bankers get paid first and the workers last? Why allow people to own shares in a company in which they don't work? This is very, very radical, I know. But imagine having a situation where you can only have shares in a company in which you actually provide labor. Now, then you have socialism, but without state control. So, that's the part of the second question. But let's go back to Obama. Did he have a choice? Of course he had a choice. He could have appointed as instead of appointing Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, he could have appointed Elizabeth Warren with a mandate to save the banks, but to expropriate the bankers, which is not a new idea. In 1992, the Swedish banks, actually all the Scandinavian banks, went bust. And what the governments did then was to say to the bankers, okay, out. They took over the banks, they nationalized them, put in a new board of directors, and within 2 years they had sold them back to the private sector, but cleansed. The original bankers had gone, okay, with new regulations. He didn't do that. He left, Jamie Dimon, Goldman Sachs intact, all the structures of power. In 2009, when he moved into the White House, for about 6 to 8 months, I grant you, not more than that. He had a window of opportunity, he had the whole nation behind him. He could have done that, even Republicans would have, even libertarians would have approved of expropriating the bankers. He didn't. Instead, he allowed Larry and Tim to create the so-called Summers-Geithner plan. If you haven't studied that, go and study it. It is a remarkable, ingenious way of conjuring up around $9 trillion and giving it to the bankers without anybody realizing it. You remember the bailout that Hank Paulson came up with was $700 billion, and everybody went, $700 billion. Initially, he was defeated in Congress, and then he managed to push it through. $700 billion is peanuts. Geithner and Summers created $9 trillion without anybody realizing it. Okay? So Obama had a choice to do it, and he did it. Okay? Now we are paying for it because Trump is president.
I've been very concerned lately about China and sort of we have transferred so much money from our economy over to China by buying all those things and supporting their economy over there so they could make more and more money, they are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
we are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's true. Right. So
suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people.
Yes, yes, I do, but I also am just concerned that we've sort of created the economic power that China sort of has now, and they're using it, I fear, going to be using it against us eventually and against the better interests of a lot of people.
Allow me to put your mind to rest.
Okay, great.
You shouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
It's very simple. And let me explain why you shouldn't worry about that. But please continue.
Well, they're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with that?
Because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So.
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom.
But I have a feeling they have a longer-term thought process that is more interventionist.
All right. But anyway, let's judge what we see. Let's judge what.
Okay.
Wait. Let's start at the beginning. The Chinese never asked Apple to go to Shenzhen and produce all the iPhones. It was Steve Jobs that decided that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It was not China that went to Washington, D.C. and demanded that they buy a third of your national debt. If they hadn't bought it, you would be in serious trouble. Mm-hmm. Okay. Number 3. I did allude to this in my talk. If in 2008 China had not cranked up their credit bubble, you would be in a new Great Depression now. So, China, the United States, and the European Union are absolutely synergistic, and they need one another in a way that if we fail to acknowledge and to nurture, billions of people, including the majority of the people in this country, are going to suffer. Now, I am not going to stand here and defend China and the Chinese Communist Party. I already made some negative remarks about the Chinese Communist Party in referring to, their attitudes as being compatible with those of Wolfgang Schäuble. My concern about China is the authoritarian manner in which the Chinese regime is treating the Chinese people. As a Democrat, I have a problem with this. Mind you, I have to tell you that, from my understanding of China, it's a very interesting social experiment, in the sense that at the local level, or the regional level, you now have a boisterous democracy. At the local and regional level. With popular success stories in overthrowing local authorities, local bureaucrats who have been corrupt, who have been this, who have been that, who have been the other. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, I have to say, firstly, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Secondly, Africa. I'll give you an example, a specific example. Ethiopia. 2004, because I happened to be there, and I have some first-hand experience of it. They went into Ethiopia. I'll tell you why they went into Ethiopia, because they suspected there was oil. Mm-hmm. because China is a major industrial power, but it lacks primary resources. Now, instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we would like, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure, we would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because it's soft power. Because because they knew that if oil is discovered, and it was discovered later, then, of course, the Ethiopian government will be much more open to Chinese oil companies coming there. They have never combined their investment with imperialistic. When I was Minister of Finance, I had a very interesting experience with COSCO, one of the Chinese national companies that, in the end, bought the port of Piraeus. When I moved into the ministry, I found a contract from the previous government that they had already sold the port of Piraeus for a pittance and under ridiculous conditions to the Chinese, under the guidance, of course, of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund as well. And in other words, as a minister, I was bound to a particular deal that was terrible for Greece. And I went to the Chinese and discussed it with them. And I was really astonished. I said to them, look, you're paying too little, you're not committing to a sufficient level of investment, and you are treating our workers as fodder. You are effectively subcontracting labor to horrible companies that exploit the workers, and I can't deal with this. And effectively, I proposed to them to renegotiate the contract. So instead of getting 67% of the shares of the port, they would get with the same price 51. The remaining shares would go into the Greek pension fund system in order to bolster the capitalization of the public pensions. Secondly, I want you to commit to 180 million euros of investment within 12 months. And thirdly, proper collective bargaining with the trade unions and no subcontracting of labor. And to my astonishment, they said, okay. Can you imagine if that was a German company or an American company? That's why I'm saying I don't think you should worry.
Okay, I won't.
Hi, big fan Yanis. Nice to see you in person, and I hope you don't mind that I'll struggle to give you a short question instead of an essay. So basically, one angle that I kind of feel was missing from tonight's talk is the angle of class formations. So the New Deal was born out of, I believe, about easily 50, 60 years of left-wing organizing among the industrial working classes who basically, as we would always say in our slogans, had their hands on the wheels. When they went on strike, they could stop production, stop the flow of profits, and so on and so on. And so by the time the Great Depression came, there was a crisis. There was a place for labor and the left at the bargaining table. I guess what I want to ask is, let's take neoliberalism at a kind of good faith and say there really was a change in the class formation that allowed them to just throw out Bretton Woods and say, we don't want to commit to this deal anymore. You don't have the power, effectively your bargaining terms, oh laborers, are not so good anymore. So then that leaves us today. Where are we? Who does have their hands on the wheel? Here we are, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Large portion of the population works in white-collar professions. Many of them are homeowners. In traditional, there aren't a lot of traditional industrial workers in this room. On the other hand, the traditional industrial workers in Ohio or wherever are losing their jobs quite rapidly due to mechanization and offshoring. So, who can put the worker's gun to the capitalist class's head anymore?
Good question. But I have to to disagree with you on one thing.
And sorry to sound a bit tanky on you.
No, you're not saying. No. It is the pertinent question, the one you asked. I don't have a splendid answer to it, I can assure you. But where I want to disagree with you is that in 1933 or 32, it was the labor movement that imposed its will using its power. There was no power. The 1929 the great crash and then the depression that followed completely depleted trade unions of any bargaining power. When you have a situation where you've got hordes of people outside the factory gates begging to be allowed into work at any wage, you don't have trade union power. So it was a political process that led, not a labor process, that led to the New Deal. And let's not forget that FDR was not a revolutionary leader, he was a patrician. Yeah, he was a bourgeois. Even Keynes, think about Keynes. Keynes hated the workers. He loathed trade unions. The reason why he introduced Keynesian economics, his proposals, which included increasing wages and welfare states and fiscal spending, on fiscal stimulus and so on, was very simple. He wanted to preserve capitalism, and he understood that capitalism was not very good at preserving itself. That's a very large part of the motivation of Roosevelt. It was not that he was being pushed by the industrial might of the labor unions.
Well,
so that gives you a bit of hope. Since that didn't happen then, maybe we don't need strong trade unions today. Today, I think that from a class formation point of view, what worries me and what I think is should be the objective is how to organize the precariat, how to turn those who live a precarious existence, the Uberized workers, into a political force, because they now are falling through the cracks of society. They are like the lumpen proletariat used to be. They are disappearing. I mean, a person who works 18 hours a day in an Uber is not a person. It's a lost soul. It's a moving, monument to misanthropy. So that for me is a major question. But okay, allow me just to be a little, to shift towards something that may sound science fiction, but I don't think it is. We need to think innovatively about collective action. I do not believe that the revolution is going to come through trade unions in industrial sites simply because they are fading. Unless the robots organize and they do the revolution on our behalf. You never know. I've read a science fiction novel where the computer in the end organized the revolution. No, but let me give you an example. Today you have millions of people who are being exploited by public utility companies that have been privatized and which are financialized. And they have already sold to financiers the next 20 years of the electricity bills that you will be paying. And as a result of this financialization, your bill is going up and up and up, completely disproportionately to the cost of producing electricity, water, whatever. What if we could work out which financial derivatives, which CDOs are packaging the bills in a particular neighborhood and another neighborhood and another neighborhood, and we organize through the internet so that we can have an electricity bill payment strike that is timed in such a way as to explode those CDOs and make them bankrupt. Now that's a form of collective action, which is using the financial instruments of the, this kind of network against it. We need to think beyond the, modern times Charlie Chaplin.
Thank you very much. Very interesting stuff.
Kalispera.
Kalispera.
That's all the Greek I know. So I originally tried to do a PhD on the topic you talked at length about the separation between political power and economic power, specifically about the European Union and how it sort of formalized this split between the political sphere is no longer has to do anything with what the people want with economic organization. No one wanted to touch that one with the 10-foot pole, so I'm doing something else now, but it remains my passion. But so to keep the question reasonably short, what is the one change, what are the one of I assume the many changes you'd like to see in the structure of the European Union that could address this, if you could choose just one thing?
Right, well, I'll be very brief in my response. We need to federate. Because there are only two choices here. Either we break it up, which many people want, even on the left, thinking that that recoiling into the bosom of the nation state is somehow going to allow them to create socialism in one country. Yeah, right. Yeah. Or we're going to have to create, a democratic union. Now the problem is that with this crisis that we have, which is both economic and political and moral, if you want, we can't have a serious discussion about federation because we have centrifugal forces that are pulling us apart. So this is why our movement, you may have heard of the movement that I'm part of, DiEM25, we're proposing what we call a European New Deal. A New Deal in order to stabilize and bring hope back so that we can have a discussion on how to federate.
Thank you very much.
I'm also going to ask a question about the European Union and about Greece and about the immigration problem, which is all the more on everyone's minds because of what Trump has just done with wiping out the agreement on the Iranian nuclear situation. I recently read that on the island of Lesbos, I believe, which is an island that receives a lot of the immigrants from the Middle East and Syria, that Greeks were attacking the immigrants. And I read that I have read for years now that conditions in the camps are terrible.
Yeah.
And something that I've wondered about for years is why is it the immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa are coming to the south of Europe, the poorest part of Europe? And why is it that there is not some common effort, perhaps this is a very naive question, but some common effort to subsidize countries like Greece, which is in terrible economic straits, to deal more humanely with these people?
It's a fantastic question. Okay, let me answer in three parts. Firstly, inform you about what's going on in Lesbos, because Lesbos is very dear to us as Greeks, to our hearts, and we are devastated by what's going on. Firstly, let me be fair to the people of Lesbos. The vast majority of the people of Lesbos have been magnificent. For 3 years now, it's an island that is very depressed, financially, economically. It's a bit like Detroit. Think of Detroit. And you have 1 million people. It's an island of 17,000 people, and 1 million people came. And most of them passed through. Now we have 50,000 left. And they went on the shore, they picked them up, they opened their houses, they opened their shops and gave them food, of course for no money and so on, the vast majority. Of course, when you have a combination of the Great Depression that we have in Greece, you have Nazis, and add to this the European Union's attitude, which is effectively to turn Lesbos into a concentration camp. And the people of the Greeks who live there then become very susceptible to the toxic narrative of the Greek Nazis, who say to them, see, these bastards came here, and now we are, instead of being a beautiful Greek Aegean island in receiving tourists and doing well, we are ourselves part of a concentration camp. So it's very, very difficult to fight against this narrative. But I tell you what I think. The situation on the ground, there are 3 camps. One is called Moria. It is the most notorious one. It is a camp that can hold under reasonable conditions, not good, but reasonable. 2,000 people, there are 10,000 people now in there. So they live in circumstances that do not befit a civilized part of the world. But that's on purpose. It is run by the European Union and the United Nations, and it is a cesspool of misery on purpose to deter others from coming. There are another 2 camps that local NGOs have created, and they're magnificent. They're absolutely magnificent. If you look at the circumstances in there, the people, the problem they have is that they don't have much capacity. So there are 300 families in one and 110 families in the other. But they live. It's actually quite heartwarming to see. Of course, the problem is that none of these people have any kind of guarantee of safety. I was talking to activists in the good camps who educate them, teach them English, their own language, because they have kids who speak Farsi, Persian, and they teach them computing, and they put a lot of effort in it, and it's really heartwarming. But they say to me, do you know the tragedy of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow morning, because the police may come in, grab one of them, put them in chains, throw them on the boat back to Turkey. So you have no idea. Is this kid, you have a 12-year-old kid there, and his or her parents, are they going to be with us for a week, 2 weeks, 6 months, 2 years? The refugees don't know, so they can't plan their lives. The activists don't know. So what do you teach them? You teach very differently if you teach somebody for 2 weeks compared to if you know you will be teaching them for 2 years. The curriculum is different, right? And the local community doesn't even know. Is this camp here going to be permanent? Are we going to assimilate them? Are we going to live with these people forever? Because the local community will react differently if they knew that, and with some support from they don't know. And the worst part is that, the reason why I left the ministry was because my party and my prime minister capitulated to the loan agreement. But immediately after that capitulation, that's what usually happens. If you capitulate on one big thing, then you capitulate on everything. After that, he also capitulated and signed the European Union Treaty with Turkey, which is an affront to civilization. Because what we're doing is we're effectively, the West, civilized Europe, we are bribing an increasingly dictatorial president of Turkey to the tune of something like $7 billion, so that he allows us to violate international law on refugees. According to international law of refugees, people coming to your country have the right, by international law, to a hearing that will determine whether they are political refugees or not. They don't have that right on Lesbos. Because the EU-Turkey treaty has deemed that Turkey is a safe country, so that when you arrive on Lesbos, you're not granted an interview as to whether you've been persecuted by the Syrian regime, by the Taliban, by I don't know whom. And you are kept there for an indefinite period. You are not allowed to go to the rest of Greece. You can wander around like a lost soul in Lesbos. But of course you live in the camp because there's nowhere else to live. Where are you going to live? On the beach? So it's purely horrible. But let's just take a broader look at that situation. You said the immigration problem. I don't see that immigration is a problem. I think that immigration is a great asset. From a European perspective, for 1,000 years, we have been populating the earth, we Europeans. We've been sending our ships and our caravans to the Americas, to Australia, to New Zealand. We destroyed all the indigenous people in the world. In Africa, we colonized. We created the new world. That's what we did. And we thought it was all right. Now what's happening is we are aging. We're becoming a sad, aged lot. Yeah? And the demographic dynamics are reversing. And we need these people. We really need these people. Germany is is being depleted. It's becoming another Japan. Greece too. We have an economic crisis as well. We are in a process of desertification. So we need these people. Instead of treating immigration, as an asset that we must collectively manage and find ways of making it work for us, Europeans, we are looking at it as a threat, and we are trying to imagine a huge wall, Trump-like, going through the Mediterranean, the North Pole. I don't know what they're going to do. It's pathetic. It's just a complete failure of the imagination. It's misanthropy. And the result, of course, is that the taller and more impenetrable the wall that we create, the only thing that changes is more deaths and greater profits for the traffickers. It doesn't stop immigration. All it does, it creates insecurity, both in the local population and in the migrant population, and profits for the traffickers. So, let them in and impose minimum wages, living wages in the countries of their origin. And if the countries cannot provide them, help them provide them. That's the solution, not walls.
Hi. I can't help but notice that we're talking about the continuum of capitalism while we overlook a graveyard. My understanding, which might be wrong, is that we're paying approximately $8 trillion for the wars in interest.
For the wars?
For the wars, U.S.
Yeah.
How does an economy overcome that? I mean, and how does that play out? 8 trillion in interest per year. If that's
No, it's not 8 trillion per year.
It's not.
No. But what is your general concern? That we pay too much for what? For the debt?
No, I'm talking about the wars, just the wars.
Yeah.
All right, let me change.
Maybe it's 8 billion, but not 8 trillion.
Okay, then my figures are wrong.
3 zeros is okay.
Okay.
Well, look, the United States of America, as Eisenhower told you in the 1950s and warned you, is predicated upon a very interesting industrial policy. You don't have a formal industrial policy, you have something called the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is essential for American capitalism in the way that the American capitalism has been created. So, the reason why Missouri and Massachusetts can be in the same union and you don't have the same problems that we have between Greece and Germany is because you have what I call a surplus recycling mechanism. You have food stamps, you have social security, and that means that money that is taxed in the surplus states is transferred to the deficit states, and that keeps a degree of balance. But the most important part of your surplus recycling mechanism is a military-industrial complex. So when Boeing gets a contract to build the new generation of fighter jets, quadrillions, yeah? The Pentagon says to them, yeah, but you're going to have to build the engine in a new site in Missouri, in the deficit places, the plane, the spare parts of this and that over there, and so on. So, to keep this going, you need some wars. I'm not proposing that this is how it should be. I'm just describing it. So, in 1991, the Pentagon and the Treasury Department in this country had a major headache. The Cold War had finished. So they could no longer pass through Congress on the basis of national security the bills that were necessary in order to keep replenishing the cruise and Pershing missiles. So they had to clear the stock. So you had the first war in Iraq. And they cleared, remember the war had finished. And they were going into the middle of the desert and firing all the cruise and Pershing missiles to get rid of them so that they could order new ones in order to maintain. So capitalism is just a very rational system because it's a very simple reason why it's so irrational, because it has a productive capacity, a capacity to produce, which far exceeds its capacity to consume. So something has to make up this difference. And war is the result, not just lack of democracy.
Hi, thank you for tonight. Question for you. if we theoretically go back to 2015, you're now in charge instead of Cyprus, in charge of Greece. Faced with harsh austerity versus Grexit, what political path would you have chosen?
Well, you know the answer. That's why I'm here. I'm not in the ministry. Why am I not in the ministry? Why did I resign? Because we had an agreement. We had a very simple agreement, and this is the only reason why I accepted the finance ministry and to run in the election. We had an agreement that there were three possible outcomes. I'll put it succinctly. Three possible outcomes. One was continuing debt bondage in the euro, which is what has been happening since 2010. For me, that was the worst possible outcome. Another outcome was Brexit, for Greece to be chucked out of the Eurozone or to choose to get out. This came with substantial costs, and it was never my proposal. But I always considered it to be better than perpetual debt bondage in the euro. When people say, but the euro is a strong currency, I say, yeah, well, if you're a pauper and you live under a bridge in New York, you have $1 in your pocket, it doesn't mean you have a strong currency. You have $1 bloody in your pocket, yeah? It doesn't help much. And then the first best, my ideal solution would be debt restructuring within the euro that would allow us to stay in the euro in a sustainable way and to end the Great Depression. So the point I was making was, no bluffing. We say to them, we don't want to get out of the euro, but we need a debt restructure, and we need the end of austerity for Greece to remain sustainable within the euro. And that's what we want. And let's sit down and we will compromise. I did say to Obama when he said, but Yanis, you have to compromise. I compromised. I said, I dream of compromise. But I'm never going to be compromised. There's a fundamental difference between the two. Okay? And we say to them that we are not going to accept that we are not putting our signature on another loan agreement that extends and pretends our bankruptcy into the future. So shoot us, kill us, get us out of the euro. We don't want to get out of the euro, but we consider getting out of the euro to be a lesser evil than staying under conditions of debt. So Cyprus supposedly agreed with me, and not only agreed with me, but considered to be more right-wing than him, and more ready to compromise. And he had some reasons. Not that he was right, but you'll be very interested to hear that one of the people that worked with me during this period in creating the plan and the narrative against the Troika and the International Monetary Fund was somebody called Larry Summers, who was actually very good, because he understood that what was happening in Greece reflected very quickly and immediately in the European macroeconomic stance, which was detrimental to the interests of the United States. So we worked together with Larry Summers, and when we met, I said, I'm very glad you haven't read my last book. And he said, why? I said, because I referred to it to you on a number of occasions in the same book as the Prince of Darkness. And he said, well, at least you called me Prince. I've been called worse. So it's clear. Yeah.
The two organizations I like to follow side by side, the DM25 movement and 6 Degrees of Citizen Space in Canada with John Ralston Saul. And I just really enjoyed John Ralston Saul's book, The Collapse of Globalism. And he describes this idea of a positive form of nationalism that we haven't explored. We think of nationalism as negative, and we often only see negative forms based on exclusion. But our movements like DM25, imagining and exploring, possibly hijacking and displacing hate with positive forms of nationalism that are centered around inclusion and sort of collective missions like reducing inequality that can capture a lot of the people that are displaced in this country, the Trump voters that might not be racist, that just wanted a better deal. And they really fall in with the flag. When someone waves the flag, they're easy to be manipulated. They just feel that they must go with it. But now in this country, when you see 2 American flags on the back of a pickup truck, that's kind of a hate symbol. The left, progressive people that enjoy inclusion have maybe allowed the flag to get stolen from them. But then at the same time, we need to integrate nationalism, possibly a new form, with ideas like a federation, to gain more power back into the political sphere against, the financial sphere?
Well, let me say that I get your drift. I grew up in a culture where the left answered this question of yours a long time ago by making a distinction not between positive and negative nationalism, but between nationalism and patriotism. Our line was always we're patriots, and the difference between a patriot and a nationalist, the patriot loves his country, and the nationalist thinks that his country has the right to steamroll over every other country. And I think that is a good way of resolving it. And also, but making this more contemporary, I think we have to appropriate the slogan, I want my country back. I think we should take this and say, yes, I want my city back. I want my neighborhood back. I want control over my city, my municipality, my state, my country. But the only way to get my country back is if others get their countries back as well. And if we all work together and we understand that to get our countries back, we need to resolve problems such as low quality jobs, low levels of investments in the green transition that the planet needs, climate change and so on, that we need to fight poverty. And it is impossible to fight poverty in one country when it's rising in other countries. If you think that you can do that, you are deluding yourself. So in effect, to embed patriotism in a narrative which sees the major problems that society faces, like poverty, low investment, problems with the health service and so on, as we see climate change. What I mean by that is climate change requires local action, that we do things here in Boston, that we do things in Massachusetts, in the United States, but we have to act globally as well. And we need to cooperate. Because resolving poverty, as I said, can only happen the Bretton Woods system is a good example. Poverty fell everywhere throughout the global system of the Bretton Woods. Inequality shrunk everywhere. It couldn't rise in one place massively and fall in another. So we have to combine love of country, of neighborhood, of community, patriotism, with a transnationalism and internationalism that allows us to claim our own countries back.
Question that I would love to hear answered from you. In the book, John Ralston Saul describes this concept where a lot of the trade that we have is fictitious. It is multinationals trading with themselves.
Yeah, of course.
And can you
it's called limit pricing.
Well, now, we were just creating these tariffs that might not really get to the root of the issue. We were punishing multinationals. We weren't punishing another nation. We were punishing multinationals that straddle two nations. And that not a lot of people in this country know how to think of these concepts and think of...
Well, I have a better way of punishing the multinationals. How about making the IRS do its job? Because if you go to Venezuela, bad example, if you go to Italy and make some money, you get taxed here. You are taxed by the IRS on your global income. You cannot say, I made $10,000 in Napoli, and therefore that's none of your business, taxman or woman. No, you get taxed on your global income in the United States, unless you're a corporation. And then you don't get taxed at all for the money you stash away all over the world. How about having the IRS do its job, instead of introducing tariffs that in the end have a detrimental effect on all of us?
Can't.
Yes, it can.
That.
Yes, of course
They
it can. Of course you can. No. They need their marching orders from Congress. They need the politicians to say to them, you're going to treat... Look, the Supreme Court, in its infinite idiocy, decided that corporations and and individuals will be treated the same when it comes to super PACs and all that, right?
Yeah.
Well, why not also decide that corporations and individuals will be treated the same tax-wise?
Okay,
I remember a beautiful poster I saw in Texas saying that...
I like it.
No, okay.
We're going to take the last question.
I believe that corporations have human rights when I see one of them being hanged. That was Texas for you.
Yeah, in the briefest and broadest of strokes, in the post-capitalistic world that you envision, what does the credit system look like, and how does it achieve equilibrium with the sovereignty of states?
Okay, how long do we have? No, but let me put it simply. If we have a system where private property is maintained over goods and services and things that give you happiness, but not over productive processes, and productive processes belong to those that work them, that are part of it, then you simply do not have a credit system. You don't need one at all.
And your justification for that is?
That credit is only necessary when you've got an asymmetrical distribution of property rights over means of production.
So you wouldn't say...
If you and I have a cooperative, if you and I have a cooperative, if we own a business together, we have a partnership, then I'm never going to be in your debt or you in my debt. We're going to be producing together, and we're going to be sharing the profits that we make, the economic rents. Well, there will be no investors.
What about the other parts?
Because investors exist only because you have an asymmetrical distribution of wealth.
And so back
if you didn't have asymmetrical distribution... But look, this is going to be the topic of my next book. I have not written it yet. So I'll see you in 2 years.